I had this sudden urge to share more as I'm sitting in front of the fire. Fire is such a incredible energy to witness and interact with also. At some point in the past, I was aware that I had this awareness that I could sense things in other people. And sometimes people would essentially ask me to like scan their body for things for different reasons intuitively, which was interesting because for a long time I would do it for others, but I wasn't doing it for myself. And then at some point I realized that if I was doing that for others, that I should also do that for myself. And it was probably, I'm just realizing now, there was probably a correlation with, the things that I was focused on externally, different, hobbies or interests, which led me to focusing on the breath more consciously. Because prior to that, it was very, very much a majority of the time was unconscious breath, where I wouldn't even realize that I was breathing. But then, certain things like, target shooting, for example, was something that I really got into and really enjoyed the physical experience of, but also studying my own self and my own being and my own body and stuff, like, because shooting targets is a really incredible way to see how tense the body is, where the breath is. And I noticed through that experience that there was a correlation between the breath and the physical harmony in the body, because anytime I sat down at the shooting bench, it became a ritual where I would sit there and consciously, intentionally slow my heart rate, slow my breath, deepen my breath, so that then when I was to pull the trigger, I was very connected with my physical body. Is, the way that I perceived it then, which now it's me simply reflecting on that is, the things that I'm tuned into and aware of now, and the contrast between where I was to where I'm experiencing, reality now. Essentially, I can kind of like plug into that version of myself and then come back to the version of myself that I currently experience. Which is, one thing that I'm only really starting to get a really deep understanding of within myself and within others. The reason why we can so often recreate, because everything is constantly created. Reality is always, the way I would choose to share the way I perceive reality is that what I see, perceive, sense is really no different than a computer video game, or I just remembered that there's consoles as well, but all of the processing required to render and display that is essentially no different than, what the human experience is like, just with different perceptions of sensory awareness for perceived senses and perceived information or feelings or whatever. that the more that I've worked with my perception and consciously shifting my perception of any perception, there's, the physical body obviously always changes, but the physical body, we can re-experience the same thing over and over again. Like if I was to continuously focus on where I've been to where I had a lot of dis-ease, a whole bunch of labels and stories and blah de blah, if I was to focus on that too much, I would then start re-experiencing that in the physical body, in the physical present. Even though, essentially that's different timelines and stuff, that's what essentially I would experience. Which is why I only briefly touch on it occasionally now. And also awareness of, because there's different levels of awareness with the physical body that I've realized, because there can be an overall sense. So one body scanning, that's if you're not yet at the point where you're actively scanning your own physical body, it's something that I would highly recommend as a practice. Come on. The way that Shadow just then was bringing my awareness to her body, where she's just finished eating, she's got a full belly, and essentially was telling me, like, make sure you're gentle with my belly because I'm so full that I'm farting. It's something I used to do, was really be stuck in being productive and doing but things like target shooting and other different experiences I had then led me to my state of being, to become consciously aware of my state of being, and then actively experience my state of being consciously. And it's in that place that I found stillness and presence and simply being. As much as it is exquisite and incredibly enjoyable to be doing lots and doing intense stuff, I found through experience that simply being, just sitting in front of the fire and hanging out with Shadow, or smelling the flowers, appreciating the incredible amount of chilies that are still on my plants, even though they've gone through winter, they're still producing chilies, where last season was a more harsh and colder season for them, and this season they haven't died off. They've just continue growing and producing, because it hasn't been that extreme. I mean, even though the season's recently changed into spring, because the mulberry trees have got fruit and buds, and so they'll be covered in leaves again in the coming weeks and full of mulberries, and which means blackberry season's coming up, and it's incredible to get excited and go and do stuff. As a lot of my life experience I spent stuck living in the mind, because growing up, there was such a heavy focus in the collective that was based on the mind, thought, and there wasn't a whole bunch, in the mid 80s, there really wasn't a whole bunch of awareness on the physical body. It was, I mean, for me, throughout my life, I experienced so much dis-ease and disharmony and, physical illnesses and broken things and injuries. It was, in some ways, it's almost like I tumbled out of the womb and just, I was like a tumbleweed in the wind, just, smashing into stuff, trying to figure stuff out. Whereas now it's like I have this balance of, I can experience the contrast of extreme duality, but then also this stillness and presence, which I very much refer to as like the holy trinity of life. You've got the polarity of duality of, good and bad, like light and dark, all of that, but then there's this middle, if it was black and white, there's grey also, and then there's the whole spectrum, but within the totality, and like being still enough to notice a couple of ducks flying over as remembering to have gratitude for the fact that I have life. I'm a living being in the same way that Shadow is a living being, and we get to, co-experience this co-creation that we've created, before we even manifested physically. And then beyond that, and then also at some point I remember watching one of Satya's videos. Satya Speaks, and he was in the Himalayas, and that was interesting because there was like, I was in the moment that I was about to say that word, it was like I was plugged into English, but there's also this like spark of connection to Hindi, and it's like that's why that word came out mumbled, because it's like I'm consciously connecting more with the Hindi language energetic frequency, that it sometimes, like, because I was focused on Satya and where he was, that it cultivated that connection more, and that spark grew, that the capacity for that connection started expanding. Like having that awareness, and the video that I remember watching at one point was Satya saying, like, tell life that you love life. Not just tell it, but like embody, I love you life, and see what life will do. And it's like I did that and more, because it was like that was an incredible golden nugget, that piece of wisdom. And I've been playing with that with so many different things, and even Shadow, like sometimes we'll go head to head and like really just express everything, like, because we can do that together. She's a being that we can really express. Like, she can go off at me and bark and growl and snarl, and I'm like, all right, awesome. And then there's times where she'll hold me through whatever I need to express, and having the awareness of what I need to suppress, to express if I've suppressed anything. Because the more suppression, the more expression that's needed. And it can be through simply being. And that's an experience that I spent nearly, I feel like it was probably nearly 2 years, a few years ago now, just mostly exploring meditative states of being, and realizing at some point that there are different states of being to experience. I can go all the way back into victim consciousness land occasionally now, and then, the collective consciousness, creator consciousness. There's so much consciousness to explore. I mean, everything seems infinite at this point that, to think at some point in my past, I was like, pull the eject button. If this is as good as it gets, pull the eject button is what I was asking for. Go back like probably 10, 15, 20 years now, just because of how sick I was, to now just being like engrossed in reality and life, that there's so much to explore, that it's like, I will work with this body to keep this body going as long as I possibly can. Like, my aim is 120 years minimum. Because these bodies, you cut your finger and it just heals, unless you believe some bullshit story about aging and some other bullshit stories that then you don't just heal naturally. Then you need all these excuses and stories and prescriptions and prognoses and mind fuckery. That's all that is. That was what I learned from mainstream medicine, was the placebo effect. Because it all is. It's all the placebo effect. You sell a story, get people to buy into it, and then they have the experience. It's that simple. And I mean, that's that's why a lot of science refuses to study the placebo effect. Well, used to, as far as I used to previously be aware, because I have no clue what science is up to these days. To be honest, I could care less. I'm more focused on customizing my own reality. And I mean, saying that, I do hope for others to have a more enjoyable experience with pharmaceutical companies compared to what I experienced, but also simultaneously not, because that was one of the most incredible catalysts for me to become consciously aware of consciousness, was through through doing the opposite of that, of shadow farting, suppressing and holding everything in and bottling it up, instead of just feeling all of it, feeling life fully, that to the point that you can taste the nectar in life in everything, in nearly every moment. There's times where I still have, challenging experiences, and sometimes there will be even brief moments of like, fuck this or whatever, but now it's just like, even if I'm deep in shit, it is still so enjoyable, because it's like, the juice is always worth the squeeze, and life is just, squeezing something else out. It's like bringing awareness from something to something else, and sometimes that can be an easy transition and integration, and sometimes that can be, depends on the stubbornness and the amount of softness and tenderness and gentleness and force or no force. It's awareness. I mean, if anyone takes anything away from this video, is the more you can consciously focus on your own breath, like even as you speak, consciously being aware of where your breath capacity is at, and like, how long can you breathe in, how long can you breathe out before you start to experience other experiences, and then do you try and fight those experiences, like trying to sneak in a quick breath, or just keep going and then running out of breath? When was the last time you actually took a full inhale and full exhale? Like, how often throughout the day do you suppress your own breath? Because your breath is your life. And it's so, at one point in my life, it was seemingly insignificant breath, whereas now it's like breath is, yeah, something that I really maintain some level of awareness on my breath at all times. And I'm also aware that as my breath changes, my heart rate changes and my experience changes also. And, there's chili plants and, like all year round, hot and cold showering, pushing what I perceive the limits to be with chilies to, growing the hottest possible chili seeds that I could, and then eating it, and then eating it and enjoying it, and then becoming accustomed to that level of spice. And, it's not something that I need to do anymore because I integrated that, where I was then able to work with my senses in more defined ways because I'd explored more depth of feeling. Then, I became aware of being able to explore the emotional body more, and realizing, the connection between all of everything, like the body, mind, spirit, soul, energy, all of it. It's, many different fractals of what it is to be a being in this experience, and I have heard of other people mentioning, like that it's a simulation life. In some ways it is, but it's also not. And it's also both simultaneously, because good old duality. Yeah, anyway, I feel like that was all I had to share currently. So I will love you and leave you.